today. Got a lot going on. I'm going to try to wrap up some of this business. Maybe some of it, maybe not. Maybe we'll get to it all. Israel, they got Charlie Kirk, as they're all yelling. Israel was trying to pay off Charlie Kirk. Oh my God. This is a psyops from start to finish. This is about being able to restrict future movements, laws. Everyone got their walking papers. All of them were flying around flapping, blame Israel. Netanyahu was running around saying, Israel didn't murder Charlie. They are all a bunch of carrier pigeons. That's what I call them. They fly to the government window to pick up their piece of paper, like a good pigeon, and fly it to their fake newsrooms, where they add the drama and horror of what they are reading as good carrier pigeons. So instead of all this business with MSM or legacy media, just refer to them as pigeons. Let's talk about the main pigeons, Bill Ackman and Candace Owens. Pretty suspect crowd if you ask me. They were also outraged over Charlie Kirk. Evidently, Bill Ackman had held a slight intervention to talk some sense into Charlie Kirk. Well, this is all a psyop, so let's not weigh in too heavily on these details. But Ackman always reminds me of Pornhub. Ackman was the one who called out Pornhub and his exposure from that case. Funny thing, now he's back into exposing this business with Charlie Kirk. It's funny how these pigeons work, right? Like in the old mob stories, they called them, stool pigeons. But Ackman is not really into private equity, he's into hedge funds and stuff. So every time Ackman opens his big mouth, it always reminds me of Pornhub and how he was yelling about Pornhub and how, oh, we gotta close it down. No, funny thing about Pornhub, funny thing about Ackman, they're running all their money through the Luxembourg area. There's actually 3 or 4 locations they're running it through. So keep talking, Bill. Every time you mention something, it reminds me that I need to go back and look further about where all this money is going. Yeah, funny thing. Around that same time, money was flowing like crazy. They were moving out of the Netherlands. They were doing this 10-year plan. And now the money has gone from the Netherlands into some other regions. And I think that is likely why they car bombed. There was a woman reporter, and I think she was very good, out of Malta. She got car bombed around 2017. Well, she's dead, so I can't ask her. But I think she may have intersected with all of this because, funny thing, right when she was there reporting, right when she gets car bombed, well, they were in the planning to move all of their financials out of Amsterdam into these other locations. And I was always puzzled about the 2 big movers are porn and high tech. You know, the Silicon Valley bros, yeah, moving all that money, hiding it all so that you can live in poverty. Yeah, that group. What they're doing is phenomenal. I mean, like for example, things that they use that they might get taxed like 25%. By this route they have sorted out, now that they've left Amsterdam, they might pay pennies. So let's say it's 25% tax on, let's say, one thing they're doing. Well, this route they have engineered, it brings them down to, in some cases, a 0 tax rate. So literally every company, and I mean every company in tech and porn and also private equity, and I kept thinking, how does private equity fit into this? Well, now I got the answers. But anyway, so every single one of them, Google, Netflix, all of them are running all of their money through these specific locations. And one of the locations is Malta, where that woman was car bombed. Interesting intersection, right? Can't talk about any more of that today. I'm not worried about getting car bombed. I'm already being killed. But anyways, I'll get into that later because it's actually pretty fascinating. This involves, I'm talking billions upon billions of dollars that they are evading taxes with, this one simple move that they changed out of Amsterdam. But let's talk about another big mouth. Who was a lead person talking about Charlie Kirk? Well, a guy named Max Blumenthal is leading the charge. Him and Ackerman are both in the charge, right? And Candace Owens. Well, Max Blumenthal, he has a place called the Gray Zone. His article quickly became the most widely cited inside scoop about Kirk's supposed rejection of Israeli funding and his feeling of being targeted for his criticism. Many social media posts, podcasts, and even some alternative media sites are quoting Blumenthal almost verbatim. framing Kirk's death as part of a geopolitical and ideological struggle. Because Max Blumenthal has a reputation for going against mainstream narratives, anti-interventionist, anti-neocon, often skeptical of Western intelligence claims, his framing resonates with audiences already inclined to distrust the official story. Does anybody bother to check? It would take 1 minute to find out who is Max Blumenthal. Max Blumenthal is the son of Sidney Stone Blumenthal, right there. They even have one of those rocks in their name. They like to have stones and those things in their names. So Max Blumenthal is the son of Sidney Stone Blumenthal. He was born in 1948. Is an American journalist, political operative, and an Abraham Lincoln scholar. A former aide to Bill Clinton. He is a longtime confidant of Hillary Clinton and was formerly employed by the Clinton Foundation so that's where his dad is, right? Now maybe Max is not like his dad, but they all have a connection. And in this case, Bill Ackman actually put up $1 million reward to find the killer of Charlie Kirk. But there's more to this story about Israel. Behind the scenes, the mobs. I was looking into further and further about the setup of Israel, and I found a fascinating juncture that we must discuss. It is one of the best stories I've come across. It is the plot line, how they engineered the whole plot against the Palestinians, how they stole that land. They moved in their people early on, they had like a mobster thing going up in Israel before all of this business with taking over the deal. And I was gonna tell you everything I know about it, because I gotta tell you, it's one of the most interesting stories out of this whole Israel story that absolutely nobody has ever bothered to mention. So that clip will play at the end here. These people did a brilliant job exploring this whole deal, this whole trick, and it is a major one. It's about how those Eastern European people, they moved in like mobsters before all this was going on. It's a lot of pre-work. So we'll get back to more of that later when you watch hear the clip at the end. They're also pushing this transgender deal in this thing. They're talking about, well, maybe he has a transgender lover, or maybe this, maybe that. Well, the transgender subject is a touchy one. They like the transgender thing because it fits with their god Baphomet. Baphomet is two sexes. Look at it. It's the same god where the word baptized comes from. This is about gathering souls for Team Satan. So yes, they're bringing up the transgender thing again with this case with Charlie Kirk. So, yeah, the transgender thing. They like that deal, right? And I listened to a clip briefly about somebody was talking about all the coding in this case. They always code these things. Charlie Kirk was born on the same birth date as George Floyd, so that must mean something. They were both born on October the 13th, and they were born 6 years apart. Now you could go down rabbit holes for years on this deal. I don't typically, well, I understand it because it's part of the whole thing, but I don't go and try to flesh it all out myself. There's plenty of people out there talking about these codes. I just don't have the time or really the interest, but I'm forced into being interested because this whole thing is built on that, right? Another interesting thing, this was held in Orem, Utah. Orem is an anagram for Rome. So all over the news, Tommy Robinson was on PBD, and he thinks he's going to be next. Well, Tommy Robinson, another major liar. I don't know why people don't look at these people's connections. I mean, Tommy Robinson, I listened to him a bit yap on the PBD show, and yeah, Elon Musk was funding him when he was locked up in jail. Yeah, they all connect. Just take a minute to check them all out. So yeah, Tommy Robinson, he's leading the charge against the Muslims. The Muslims are going to take over everything. Well, the government's the one who's pushing the Muslims. Let's not blame the Muslims in this deal, okay? The Muslims are being run out of their countries. Where else are they supposed to go, right? And just to give you a little more flavor to these people, Sam Altman, the guy who's starting ChatGPT, he's the one who's going around Silicon Valley. They always say, I'm not into money. I'm doing this just for my good of my own will. Well, Sam Altman, interesting case. Tiny little man that he is. Always talking about not wanting to have money. This is about the good of all, right? Why does he drive $1 million cars? Why is he being accused of his own sister for raping her as a kid? And most importantly, did Sam Altman kill that whistleblower? I don't know. These people seem to like to kill everybody. Nobody talks about it, but yet they seem to worship at the feet of these people. Peter Thiel, another one. I have a file about Peter Thiel that hopefully I'll get to. Peter Thiel had someone tossed off a balcony in Miami, someone who was allegedly an ex-lover of his. Yes, thrown off a balcony in Miami, dead. These are the people we should be looking to. These are the ones who will be controlling our speech in the future. Murderers, psychopaths, and creeps who call themselves tech bros. And let's not lose sight of who we can't criticize. We can't criticize the gypsies or the Jews. Do a little test of your own. Don't just listen to me. Go over to any ChatGPT thing and make a couple statements about the gypsies or the Jews and tell me how quickly you get shut down. I have tested them all. I'm not just guessing here. So you can't say a word about those gypsies or the Jews. Another strange detail that I haven't been mentioning, but now that I've got the microphone on, I might as well go through the list. Where they have all their Hollywood events, where they have the Oscars and all that. Where do they have those? Well, in the place called the Shrine Auditorium. The people that wore the red fez hats? The Shrine Auditorium, the one built and operated by the Shriners Fraternal Organizations, the ancient Arabic order of the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine. Yeah, that group. They built the Shriners Auditorium. It was built in 1906. Rebuilt in 1926 after a fire. These people are always surrounded by fires. And it was owned by the Al-Makeba Shriners. You gonna tell me this country isn't totally Muslim already? And that Al-Makeba Shriners is part of the Shriners, which is part of Freemasonry. The Academy used it for multiple Oscar ceremonies because of its size. It could accommodate the biggest stars, press, and massive TV productions. Famous Oscar moments at the shrine include the 1998 Titanic sweeping 11 Oscars. They never mentioned the captain went rogue and killed himself with the whole ship, right? Brought down everybody to get those 3 men. 1999, Robert Benigni's exuberant chair climbing celebration. 2001, The Gladiator winning Best Picture, and that was the last year before the Oscars moved to the Dolby Theater. They hosted the Grammy Awards for many years, 1970s to 1990s. They hosted the Screen Actors Guild Awards and People's Choice Awards. They're used for concerts, pageants, and TV specials. Yes, the Shriners, the red fez hats, are all over Hollywood, right? And where did we get some of these words? Gypped or Jewed. Have you heard the word? Well, they gypped me out of a few pennies here. No, that guy Jewed me down. He got a better price. Where did those 2 words come from? Well, if you guess gypped comes from gypsies, you win the prize. Likely derived from the word gypsy, itself a misnomer for the Romani people, gypped. Romani groups were stereotyped as dishonest or tricksters by outsiders. This stereotype was reflected in language. Many consider gypped offensive because it perpetuates a negative stereotype about Romani people. No, I think it completely defines these people who are willing to shuffle money around on these plans to save billions and billions and billions of tax dollars all for themselves. And then we have the phrase Jewed down. The origin from anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews as being cheap, miserly, or overly shrewd in business. Historical context, such stereotypes were common in Europe and America, fueling discrimination. Widely recognized today as anti-Semitic and offensive. Both terms are good examples of how language can normalize prejudice, even unintentionally. Neutral alternatives like cheated, swindled, or bargained down are now preferred. No, I really prefer gypped and Jewed. Those are my words. So let's take a look at the groups. I haven't even gotten to tell you about what the show is about today. I'll get there in a bit. Groups frequently targeted in history. Who's number one? The Jewish people. Who's number two? The Romani people, the Gypsies. Funny how that works. Number three, the indigenous people. Number four, Africans are fourth. Religious minorities are fifth. Ethnic and political groups are sixth. So why do Jews and Romans often appear first? Jewish and Romani persecution is often listed prominently because longevity and consistency. Both groups face exclusion across many different countries and centuries, from medieval Europe to modern times. Their visibility in European history, much of Western historical writing focused on Europe. See, funny how that works out. I will be talking about historians in a bit here, though. Where Jews and Roma were prominent minority groups. This meant their persecution is heavily documented and taught. And the Holocaust as a turning point. Who could have guessed, right? The genocide of both Jews, Shoah, and Roma or Pogroms during World War II was so systematic and industrialized that it became a defining event in human rights discourse. So, and this is big money also. Don't ever forget the money angle, because the Yad Yasmin Library, that's the official museum over there in Israel, holds over 169,000 titles related to the Holocaust in 64 languages. They have a bibliography compiled listing around 20,000 items, books, journal articles, pamphlets specific to Holocaust literature. These numbers include many different types: academic works, survival memories, historical studies, fictional accounts, etc. So, why is it locked up in a museum, I ask? Well, because this is how you control things, right? You control the narrative, you control it all, and then you can use that to generate fear, to keep control by fear. So, what happens is this. First, we're going to be talking about the Holocaust-related stuff, but before we get to that, what they claim is after World War II, Romani people continue to face strong prejudice in Europe. There was no Nuremberg moment. The Nuremberg trials focused on crimes against Jews, political prisoners, and others. Romani genocide was barely mentioned. See, funny about that, right? In many countries, Romas were still stereotyped as criminals or vagrants, so their suffering was not prioritized politically or academically. During the Cold War, much of Eastern Europe, where the many Romani were killed, was under communist regimes. So what they claim is this: state histories avoided minority issues. They say communist governments tended to emphasize a unified narrative of anti-fascist victory rather than highlighting the suffering of particular minority groups. And they say they didn't know much about Romanis because Western scholars had limited access. Archival material in Eastern Europe was often inaccessible until the 1990s, delaying serious research. Now, wasn't that convenient? Focus on the Holocaust as a central narrative. Post-Holocaust scholarships centered on the systematic genocide of the Jews, which was more extensively documented from Nazi records, survival testimonies, Allied reports, etc., leading to more major efforts to record and publicize histories. The Romani genocide, that's what they're calling it actually, was sometimes treated as a side story or lumped into a category of other victims, which minimized its uniqueness or scale, or maybe took our eyes off of these Romani people, right? I mean, their name does start with Rome. Let's all agree on that, right? And they claim it's because there's few Romani scholars. Not many organizations and universities push for voices for this research. Even some early historians repeated prejudiced ideas about Romani people, which kept the topic marginal. But in the 1990s, the Eastern Europe archives after the fall of the Soviet Union made research possible. So, international organizations, Council of Europe, pushed for recognition of Romani suffering. Museums like the U.S. Holocaust Museum now include the Romani genocide prominently. Isn't that convenient? Another lead character that has always drawn my attention, a very famous dancer, Carmen Amaya, A-M-A-Y-A, Carmen, or Carman, was Spanish by nationality, but of Romani gypsy heritage. Carmen, or Carman Amaya, was the first woman to be able to dance the flamenco like the men did. Well, because Carmen was likely a man, right? To be the first flamenco dancer, and she was also then ended up in Hollywood, very, very famous, Carmen Amaya, also Romani. The numbers are starting to stack up here. She was born in Barcelona, Catalonia, Spain. Her parents were Romani. So, here's how I think it happened. They had a retreat and consolidation. The core group, the 1%, the hideout was in Germany. They disappeared from public view, maybe after a massive event, a plague, a reset, or war. They preserved the real technology and knowledge while letting the rest of society collapse into confusion. Germany became the main fort for these people, a place of reorganization, secrecy, and planning. And keep in mind, I am making all of this up, but it makes sense to me. They have the knowledge monopoly because they have writing systems, archives, and perhaps machines that can replicate or reproduce information quickly, making copy-paste history possible. Yes, we're from an advanced society in this script that I've written about this. We are from an advanced society. They are using tools that were common knowledge way past what we already knew about. So the fact they were hiding out in Germany, they had tools that the rest of us didn't know they had. They had ways to word process things. They had ways to copy and paste history. With no competing voices, they get to decide what the official version of the past would be. The script they've written, they had to write a script to get all this going, right? They had to write this script a couple hundred years ago because they also had to trick their own people into following the script. You can't say, go after all the Muslims without some reason why you want all the Muslims dead, right? So you give them the reasons by history and wars and stuff, right? So the script they write is deliberately binary, good versus evil, saved versus damned, left versus right. All they did was they created dualities to lock humanity in a constant loop of conflict, no gray area, no unity. And they had the Bible template. They produced a master narrative like the Bible that is simple enough for everyone to follow, but deep enough to be endlessly interpreted. They came up with, out of the Bible template, they came up with myths, heroes, villains, cycles of fall and redemption, a perfect psychological control system. Then they put together copy and paste civilizations. They went from Egypt to Greece to Rome to Christendom to nation states. Each era a stage is set, repeating the same archetypes. They change costumes between scenes. They change names, but the storyline is always about power, conflict, obedience, and redemption. They pick divide and conquer as a permanent strategy. Politics is a scripted game. Two parties, two sides, but both controlled by the same hand. People are tricked into cheering for their team while the real game moves forward. Conflict as energy source. Wars, revolutions, ideological battles are necessary to keep the population busy and distracted. Each conflict justifies new rules, new taxes, new controls, and the cycle repeats. I've been saying for years this is nothing but a copy and paste operation. It shows the illusion of progress through technology and the narrative control. Technology was dripped out slowly to make it look like humanity is advancing. Just like I've talked endlessly about, they don't have photos of dead Civil War people, but in piles, because they claim photography would have been too difficult to take pictures of those people at that era. Well, I think it was to hide the fact those bodies were likely black bodies and not white bodies. They just found 1,000 or so white bodies, put them into a pile, and they said, oh yeah, this is all the dead bodies. So they used cameras as also another dripping out of technology. But really, the group had this technology all along. They really already had electricity, printing, engineering, and maybe even free energy. So then they got up information monopoly. They were the ones who came up with printing presses. They came up with newspapers, radio, TV, internet. Each wave gives us the illusion of more freedom, but actually centralizes the narrative further. History books are updated to fit the current agenda, erasing anything that doesn't fit. So why does this feel simple? Well, when you step away from the noise, the pattern is clear and repetitive. Control the story, control the mind, control the world. Keep humanity divided. They will never unite against you. Keep technology scarce. They depend on you. Keep the timeline believable. They don't even know there was an alternative. This framework explains why so much of history feels suspiciously too neat, as though someone wanted it to be consistent enough to hold it together, but not so complicated that ordinary people couldn't follow it. So why does all the divide and conquer business work? Because humans have tribal wiring. Our brains evolved to survive in groups. Loyalty to the tribe meant protection, food, survival. The scriptwriters exploit this by presenting every issue as us versus them, triggering ancient survival instincts. Binary morality, good, evil, left, right, science, religion. Binary choices create emotional urgency. People stop asking if the frame is even real and instead argue over which side is right. That's the thing. In this Charlie Kirk thing, obviously people are asking, is this real? But the majority are not even questioning, is it real or not? They're just trying to decide, was Israel the one who murdered him or not? So once these teams are established, not picking a side feels like betrayal. Those who refuse to play are labeled unpatriotic, radical, coward, or traitors. So if we assume that my takeover scenario is true, the teams are pre-scripted. They exist to keep the population occupied. Politics, two main parties fighting forever, both serving the same agenda. Religion, competing faith and sex, but all pointing to obedience and sacrifice. Ideology, capitalism versus communism, science versus faith, endless diatribes that never resolve themselves. In this setup, team membership becomes an identity, not just a choice, which means people will defend their team, even against evidence that the whole game is rigged. People say, don't be neutral, as if neutrality is the worst crime. Algorithms, media, and influencers reward outrage, deepen tribal lines, and make dissenters feel isolated. When someone steps outside the game board and says, maybe both sides are fake, they get mocked, banned, or labeled as conspiracy theorists. It's a feedback loop. The more the game board polarizes, the more teamlessness feels unsafe, which keeps the system stable. So, if you go with my theory, the genius of the takeover is this. They don't just divide people, they convince people to self-police the division. The population becomes the enforcer of this script, shaming anyone who won't pick a side. This is why questioning the script feels rebellious. You're not just rejecting one team, you're stepping off the entire game board. And let's talk a little bit about pigeons. For most of history, pigeons were highly valued animals. They were messengers and military assets. For centuries, carrier pigeons were used for communications in war and trade. Even in World War I and II, they saved communications in war and trade by carrying critical messages through dangerous territory. But pigeons are also a food source. But pigeons also symbolize peace and spirituality. But people call them flying rats. I call them flying rats because I think all of these people operate more like pigeons. Pigeons adapted extremely well to cities. Their populations boomed as they fed on leftover food and garbage. Overcrowding made droppings a real issue, damaging buildings, statues, and cars. Disease fears. Pigeons carry pathogens, though actual transmissions to human is rare. Public health campaigns exaggerated the risk, cementing the dirty pest image of pigeons. This is why I think that pigeons are the best name to call these so-called news reporters today, because they literally just fly around like rats with wings and carry information from one thing to the other. But pigeons actually were important in ancient Egypt. They were domesticated, and early use of pigeons, they were called rock doves, were among the first domesticated birds, and Egyptians were some of the earliest to keep them by at least 3000 BCE. That number 3 again, right? Every story relates back to Egypt. Ever wonder about that? Well, I'll be telling you why in a bit here. While Mesopotamian Persians are often credited with the earliest postal pigeons, there is evidence that Egyptians also used pigeons for long-distance communications, especially in later dynasties. Pigeons could carry messages hundreds of miles faster than human couriers, a major advance for ruling elites. So, pigeons were actually very popular in Egyptian religion. The reason I'm bringing up pigeons is not only because I think the people actually resemble flying rats themselves, is that everything you look for, you will find it basically traces to Egypt, right? Now, why exactly is that? Why does everything trace to Egypt? So, Egyptian devotees and pigeon-keeping traditions spread across the Mediterranean. The Greeks and Romans adopted them for meat production, religious sacrifice, communication. Romans preferred pigeon post systems later used by traders and the military. By the Middle Ages, dovecotes, or pigeons, were a symbol of wealth and privilege in Europe. Only lords were allowed to own them in some feudal societies. So, why does everything happen about Egypt? Those gypsies, right? They wrote the whole story, right? If you're going to write a big bunch of lies and stuff, center it around yourself, right? Make it your story. Own it. Egypt owns this story. Egypt was one of the first true nation states around 3100 BCE, unified under a single ruler. They developed a centralized bureaucracy, taxation system, monumental architecture, and organized religion earlier than most regions. Ancient Egypt was a knowledge hub. Yeah, if you're going to write your own history, claim that you're the smartest, fastest, quickest, most intelligent person walking on the earth, right? Pump up your own story. So Egypt was a knowledge hub. Medicine, mathematics, astronomy, writing system, and engineering were advanced for their time. Many later civilizations, Greek, Rome, and Islamic Golden Age, drew from Egyptian knowledge, cut and paste. Greek philosophers and Plato reported similar studies in Egypt. Egypt was strategically located between Africa, Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Now, isn't that convenient? They traded with Mesopotamia, Nubia, and the Levant, and later Greece and Rome, becoming the conduit for goods and ideas. I used to think all roads led to Rome, but really all roads seem to lead to Egypt. But the famous phrase about Rome comes from the Roman road system. an incredible infrastructure achievement that physically connected the empire. But when we look at origins, Rome itself was deeply shaped by Egypt. Many Roman gods were syncretized with Egyptian deities. Example, Isis became hugely popular in Rome. Cut and paste, right? Architecture, obelisks, the tall penis symbols, the columns, and sphinx motifs were imported to Rome, where many still stand there today. Roman cities admired Egyptian priestly wisdom. Julius Caesar and later emperors treated Egypt as a jewel of the empire, both for its grain supply and its mystique. So while Rome may have been the center of political power at its height, Egypt was often seen as the wellspring of spiritual, scientific, and cultural knowledge. So, the era that I think we need to pick up on started after 1666 with that Zivi person. So let's take a look before 1666 and the ancient roots of scientific inquiry. And here you find some interesting things. Priests in Egypt were not just religious figures, they were also astronomers, doctors, and engineers. They tracked celestial cycles to regulate agriculture and ritual calendars. They developed sophisticated medicine with diagnostic paper and surgical techniques and mathematic systems, geometry for land surveying and pyramid construction. Yeah, and they never quite finished those pyramids, now did they? So many Greek thinkers like Thales, Pythagoras, and Plato either studied in Egypt or influenced by Egyptian and Mesopotamian thought. The Greeks shifted from sacred knowledge to rational inquiry, laying groundwork for natural philosophy. Scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba in the 8th to 13th century preserved and expanded Greek and Egyptian knowledge, developed algebra, optics, and experimental medicine. This material later flowed into Europe, setting the stage for the Renaissance. So, I gotta drop a bomb on you here that you probably never saw coming. 1660s and the birth of modern science. Around 1660s to 1666, that key point that they took over the game board. What was happening then? Well, funny thing happened. Royal Society of London, 1660, formalized the idea of doing experiments, documenting results, and sharing knowledge, what we now call the scientific method. So, emphasizing observation over authority. Figures like Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, and Christian Huygens were making breakthroughs in physics, optics, and mathematics. Newton's principles in 1687 is often seen as the capstone of this era. So, before the 19th century, scientists were called natural philosophers. The term scientist was coined later in 1833, but the culture of methodical, collective, investigative data to this mid-17th century period. So, they were natural philosophers and all kinds of stuff. They did not become scientists until that era, right? Egypt provided the template of a priestly scientific class, people devoted to studying the natural world for practical and cosmic order. The Enlightenment secularized that role, detaching it from religion and giving it its own authority. You could argue that the Royal Society of London was a revival of the Egyptian House of Life concept, a place where knowledge was collected, tested, and preserved for rulers and society. Many mystic traditions, Hermeticism, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, treat Egypt as a source of secret knowledge. The Hermetic corpus, credited to Hermes, was said to originate in Egypt. Egyptian symbols like the Eye of Horus, pyramids, and scarabs still carry esoteric weight today. Even the U.S. Great Seal has a pyramid. It has the eye. It reflects this Egypt as origin symbolism. So if you're following along with my view, this view, history isn't a collection of events. It's a storyboard, carefully written to justify the present system of power. So let's break this down. Let's look at Egypt first, the original myth. Egypt becomes the starting point because it gives the illusion of ancient continuity and authority. In Egypt, they have priests, they have pyramids and hieroglyphs that provide mystique, a kind of brand identity for human civilization. Whether it really happened or not, the narrative sets up the idea of order from above, was chosen elites guiding humanity. Then we have the Greek and Rome era, the copy and paste era, I call it. Insert philosophers, republics, empires, but really these serve as templates for modern governance and culture. Rome gives us all roads lead to Rome, laws, armies, and Caesars, basically normalizing empire as the natural state of humanity. Copy and paste becomes the engine. Rome collapses, Europe falls, but then magically revives as Renaissance and Enlightenment. The next act, the missing builders and the Gilding Age. In my theory, the actual builders, those that made the incredibly pre-electric mansions, rail systems, and even perhaps free energy tech, they all vanished. Maybe removed, maybe written out of the story. The new ruling class is then woven into the empty houses and begins rewiring history to claim they built it all. This narrative of progress, struggle, discovery, and scientific advancement gives legitimacy to their rule. So then we have industrial revolutions, world wars, space races, all dramatic set pieces in the script. Each one resets the game board, centralizes control, and gives the population a new story to rally around. Science and media become the scriptwriters, consistently updating the myth to keep people on the game board. So why would they even have to write a script? Well, because if reality is a managed game, then a shared timeline is essential. For continuity, people need to believe they came from somewhere, that progress is real. Also for control, a consistent story keeps people aligned, prevents chaos, and justifies why certain groups hold power. If the past is scripted, the present appears inevitable. The rulers seem like the natural result of history. Predictability. Scripts allow for planned events, planned crises, and planned solutions that keep the game moving forward. If this whole structure is synthetic, then we would expect recycled motifs. We had the pharaohs, we had the emperors, we had the popes, then we have the presidents. Different costumes, different archetypes. Key themes. PSYOPs as lawfare. Events can be framed or amplified to justify new restrictions on movement, speech, or protest, shaping future laws before the public even debates them. Controlled messaging. Leaders issue official lines that are quickly repeated across major outlets, giving the impression of consistency and urgency. And they have rewritten catastrophes. They had the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, the plague, world wars, always followed by rebirth or reset society. Each age is set to rediscover or revive the wisdom of the ancients, but the ancients themselves may be fictional characters. So, this may be a different way of thinking about things that other people are expressing them, but instead of history explaining reality, reality is explained by a script of history, is how I see it. They are just making this, whatever this reality we're in, their own by doing their history books, right? And news personalities and outlets act like the carrier pigeons, faithfully delivering the message from the powerful to the public, adding emotion and outrage to keep people engaged. Once the talking points are released, alternative interpretations are sidelined, and the public conversation becomes locked into the approved frame. Who is to blame? What must be done? So it gives us a manufactured sense of consensus. Everyone seems to agree instantly, which pressures dissenters in what needs to stay silent. Laws and crackdowns can be rolled out faster using emotional reaction as the engine. Public becomes conditioned to accept every crisis equals a loss of freedom for our own safety. So let's take a look, let's dive back around these khazars. I used to always wonder, where did the color green in Christmas come from? Well, the khazars, their colors were red, green, white, and black. The colors of Christmas. Santa wore red and white and had a black belt, right? What else is of Egypt? Well, interestingly enough, red and green are also colors of Egypt. Imagine that. Egypt has used red and green as important symbol colors since ancient times, according to their own people, right? Going back thousands of years, according to them, right? So let's take a look at how these colors also tie these gypsies to Egypt to today. As early as the Old Kingdom, Egyptian art and artifacts include red and green among their standard palette of pigments. In tomb paintings and architectural decorations, green, often from malachite, symbolizes life, regeneration, vegetation, fertility, and renewal, especially tied to the Nile's floods and gods like Osiris. So, red, they got the red from red ochre to symbolize multiple things: life, health, vitality, but also chaos, danger, evil, or the desert. Red could also have both positive and negative connotation. What's everybody wearing on their heads? Red hats, right? Everybody is wearing red baseball hats. And I'm not going to go into it today, but you know that red fez hat. I know you think, well, yeah, she's coming up with that fez hat again. Well, actually, an interesting story, but I don't have time for it today. But the red hat, that fez hat, came from Egypt. Funny thing, huh? Ha ha ha. And what are they running at round and around? Red baseball hats. So, in more modern times, especially in the 20th century, red and green are part of the pan-Arab colors. Red, white, black, and green, used widely in flags of many Arab countries, including Egypt. The modern Egyptian flag, since the Egyptian Revolution in 1952, uses red, white, and black, but not green. Some of the earlier ones use green. So supposedly, according to these people and this history, you may think it's real. I don't, but you may. From pre-dynastic Old Kingdom Egypt all the way to today, Egypt, we're talking about broadly the civilization, has included red and green among its most meaningful colors. So, and also, there's a whole bunch of other countries that have just red and green in their flags. So, we have Morocco, a solid red flag with a green pentagram, the Seal of Solomon. You have Portugal, vertically split green and red on one side. Yeah, Bangladesh, green with red. Belarus, red and green and white. Maldives, green and red with white crescent. Malawi, 3 horizontal stripes, black, red, and green with a red rising sun. Guyana, green field with a red triangle and a yellow border. Well, yellow is to get green, you add a little bit of black to yellow, I think, if I remember my color charts correctly. But anyway, so we have the Pan-Arab and Pan-African influence on this yellow and green business, which they say originates from Egypt, right? So we have the Pan-Arab colors on flags of Egypt, Jordan, Sudan, Kuwait, UAE, Syria, etc. So, yeah, quite obvious they like those colors, right? So, green is associated with paradise in the Islamic tradition, and the Prophet Muhammad, red was often used in decorative motifs. Christmas colors in Christian majority countries, red and green are symbolic for Christmas, holly leaves, and berries. Egypt's use of red and green as symbolic colors is very old, but many other nations use the exact same color combinations today, especially in the Arab world and Africa. Morocco is probably the closest parallel, since his flag is literally just red and green. You know, Morocco, the home of the fez hat. So let's take a look at how this red colors came out of Egypt according to the script. 3,000. Of course, we got to have that number 3, right? The number 3 is the side of the pyramid. These people have their hands permanently locked into the side of a pyramid. Look at them. They all have their hands locked into that space. Charlie Kirk does it. They all do it because that is their secret symbol of ancient Egypt. God, I'm speaking poorly today. Ancient Egypt. So 3000 BCE onward, ancient Egyptians were already using red, which they got from iron oxide, and green malachite in tomb art, amulets, and hieroglyphic decorations. Symbolism was very advanced early on. The green was life, rebirth, growth, fertility. Osiris was often painted green. Red was energy, vitality, but also danger and chaos associated with Seth. These associations are over 4,000 years old, making Egypt one of the first civilizations to encode meaning into color systematically. So yes, all roads are leading to Egypt as far as I can tell. So Egypt was the first, literally by thousands of years. Most other countries using red and green today only started, pay attention to this, in the last 100 to 150 years. Couldn't be by the time of the last takeover, could it? This makes Egypt's use unique. It wasn't just decorative, it was tied to religion, cosmology, and the concept of eternal life. Later nations likely chose red and green for very different reasons. Yes, because they got taken over. When they broke up the Middle East, they got new flags. Everybody got new flags, right? I would call that a pretty specific reset, right? So, let's take a look at how history really works. How official versions often give us facts but stop short of connecting them. We're going to talk about these theories I've come up with called dot collectors versus dot connectors. The dot collectors are people who write down dates and names but leave the bigger picture for someone else to piece together, which is why so many events feel disconnected when really they are part of one long pattern. And then from there, we're going to dive into pogroms. They're targeted attacks on Jewish communities that were allowed or even encouraged by authorities. We'll trace them from medieval Europe through the Russian Empire and into the 20th century. So we're going to also be exploring in a bit the formation of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and that is a kicker. That is a story about how they set up the whole deal in Israel. The early days of the IDF, so is a big deal. I'm sorry this isn't that organized today. What's going on right now is my blood-brain barrier has been breached, so I'm moving into that dementia phase, but I can still keep track of things. But I used to be able to take, let's say 100, if I had 100 pages of script for a show, that I'd written, I used to be able to go through it all and organize it, right? Well, now I can't even get close to that, so you just have to kind of learn to roll with me here, because I no longer can really put things into order. So now we're going back to Egypt again. So in Egypt, the red was called the drescher, and that was power, blood, fire, and the desert chaos stuff. And they also used blue. Blue was for the sky, the Nile, creation, and divine protection. What do we have on the U.S. flag? Red, blue, and white. Often linked to life-giving waters and the heavens. So that's where we get the color blue from. And we had green and white and black, and also, so Egyptian colors was highly symbolic and consistent across thousands of years, appearing in tombs, temple walls, clothing, and ritual objects. They were tools of magic and theology. So this all means a great deal to all of them, and is all tied to all of their little symbol business, right? So I'm going to be taking a break here, and I will be back on the other side. Okay, I'm back. Part of the reason this file is an extra hot mess is because I started off with one file, and then I pulled information out for the last two shows, and now I'm pulling more information out for this show. And what happens when your blood-brain barrier starts getting crossed is things become a little bit confusing. So the rest of the shows I have to share won't be this confusing, because once I start looking at the copy, I cannot recognize it again the second time. But anyway, so let me keep moving here. So, because I really do have a point here today. And let me finish up with these colors. Yeah, they have it all written up. Even mummies were sometimes painted black to invoke Osiris's regenerative powers. Black symbolized the fertile silt of the Nile after the flood, the reason Egypt called itself Kemet, which meant the black land. Boy, they thought of it all, didn't they? Either they thought of it all, or it's all true. One of the two, right? So black meant death and rebirth. So not purely negative. And then the color blue, the magical purpose. Blue was protective and regenerative, connecting the wearer to the eternal cycle of the cosmos. The Egyptians often used red, white, black, and green, and blue together to create a total cosmological palette. So this all traces back to those Khazars, right? And the drescher, the red business, deshret. The red crown is called the deshret, and that represents Lower Egypt. And then they have a white crown. So yes, the only people wearing red hats were the Egyptians, with that deshret hat, which I'll have more about later. And the fez hat was worn by those Shriners, the red fez hat, and now they're all running around wearing red baseball hats, right? So they claim that red and blue are arguably the top two colors in Egypt's sacred and royal symbolism. Blue framed the world as eternal and divine. Red provided the energy, passion, and even the destructive force necessary for kingship and ritual magic. Together, they represented balance, cosmic stability, plus the power to act. So I think I've covered enough about this red and green business. I have everything you ever want to know about it over on my website. Pretty fascinating because it's all over the place, right? And where else do they wear these colors? Well, I think one of their biggest tricks was making people white. I did a show about they created white people as a way to symbolize power. Well, they also wore those robes, and also priests wore red caps. I forgot to mention that. Priests also wore red caps. So we have the fezzes wearing the red fez hat. We have popes and them wearing red hats. And we have the people running around today wearing red baseball caps, right? So, but they also wore robes. They had the Knights Templar, the 12th to the 14th century, famous for their white mantles with red crosses, a badge of spiritual purity and elite military brotherhood, also the same symbol worn on the Ku Klux Klan. We had the Knights of Malta, or the Hospitallers. They wore black and white robes with the 8-pointed Maltese cross, continuing the tradition of knightly orders tied to church and finance. And then we have the white robes in Catholic and Orthodox rituals, symbolize purity, another mask of moral authority. So white is pure and chosen. It sets people apart. It's a visual code understood across cultures. The KKK and the knightly image. The Ku Klux Klan deliberately borrowed knightly titles like the Grand Wizard, Exalted Cyclops, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Their white robes were not just for anonymity, they were ritual garb, turning lynchings into quasi-religious ceremonies. Their regalia often included crosses or Maltese-like symbols, it reinforcing the idea of a sacred order, defending a certain social order. So there's a clear line between medieval knightly imagery and later white-robed orders, even in the U.S. South. The Khazars and their kingdoms collapsed and theorized in some interpretations to have scattered into European trading and banking networks, becoming a hidden elite. White satin was their uniform, a luxurious elite fabric, not common peasant cloth, evoking secrecy, privilege, and ritual. Knights arriving as a moment of transition, just as the 1600s, when Cromwell, City of London, and the Royal Society, and all that stuff with the scientists, the arrival of the knights signals a new order of control, replacing the old. So along this game board, we have a lot of people in white robes. We have the medievals, the Templars, Hospitallers. They wore white robes. We had the early modern, we had the Jesuits and other clerics. They wore black robes, the same elite network positioning. We have the KKK, the Masons, fraternal orders, ceremonial robes as a claim to moral, ritual authority. They came up with songs, films, and symbols to keep these white robes and symbols alive. Knights, white robes, sacred orders. So this kind of reinforces my game-born theory that positions the same, only the costumes and languages all changed. White robes are simply the latest mask of continuity. Priests and clergy, they wore long white or black vestments, stoles, mitres, worn during rituals, to signal purity, sanctity, and that they were acting as not as ordinary men, but as mediators for God. It commanded respect and obedience. It set them visually apart. Then we have the knights and nobility. They used coronation robes, cloaks lined with crimson crowns, to display divine right and wealth. They are not just rulers, but anointed rulers. It creates awe, reinforces that power is sacred, not just political. Then we have judges and magistrates. They also wear robes. Still worn today in many countries, black and sometimes red. The purpose to erase individuality and represent the law itself. Makes a courtroom a ritual space. Verdicts carry weight like religious pronouncements. Then we have scientists and doctors. They wear white coats and lab coats. A relatively modern innovation, 19th century onward, to signal cleanliness, even though these were the same people who didn't even know to wash their own hands. And clinical detachment. It created trust. The public sees the white coat as a badge of authority, almost priestly. Well, of course, because they see priests in white coats, right? Secret societies and orders. The Masons, Knights of Malta, the Ku Klux Klan used ceremonial robes, aprons, sashes to create hierarchy, ritual seriousness, and shared identity. And it strengthened their group cohesion and mystique. And also, who else wears white coats? Well, butchers wear white coats, right? Somebody mentioned that, and I thought that was brilliant. Yes, butchers, you know, the people that hack up those animals all bloody, they wear white coats also. So they actually, I think, coats or uniforms function as a visual mask. They cover the individual and emphasize the role they play. They create a sense of ritual space. Something solemn is happening. They produce a psychological distance, making the wearer an authority figure, not just another person. Even the scientist's lab coat is essentially a modern ritual garment. It signals that what happens in the lab is sacred knowledge work, not just tinkering. It invites trust. Trust me, I'm wearing the white coat. So yeah, I think this fits my theory perfectly. The robes are game pieces. They move the priests, the kings, the judges, the doctors, the scientists into key positions where they can shape society. And they were all wearing white robes, right? Or black robes, one of the two. Whether in cathedrals, castles, courts, or labs, the robe jacket acts as the same signal. I speak for higher authority. I wear the white robe. So yeah, robes seem to be the common denominator, from altars to coronations to courtrooms to operating rooms. They mark the players who have the power to decide, bless, condemn, heal, or declare the truth. The color white is especially powerful. Purity, neutrality, trustworthiness, but also untouchable. A white coat or robe signals, I am clean, I am set apart, I am above suspicion, as I rape your children and murder everybody in my sight. No, I just added that part. So, Christian tradition. Priests often wear white for baptisms, weddings, and feast days, symbolizing holiness and resurrection of that Jesus character again, right? White is worn by Brahmins in Hinduism, by Sufi mystics, by shamans, a universal spiritual signal. White robes tell the congregation, I am not speaking as an ordinary person, but as a vessel for divine truth in this white coat. So we have lab coats from the 19th century onward introduced to visually separate doctors from barbers and folk healers, signaling scientific legitimacy. The coat is white so that any dirt, blood, or contamination shows immediately, reassuring patients. Authority. Patients often obey a doctor in a white coat without question. A well-studied psychological phenomenon called the white coat effect. Like doctors, scientists adopted white coats to symbolize objectivity and clinical detachment. White is really what I call the theater of truth. The lab coat is part of the performance of science, showing that what happens here is controlled, clean, and rational. Think of every news clip of experts in white coats handling test tubes. It instantly conveys credibility. So yes, they've used this white coat for a very long time. Whether it's a confessional, a courtroom, or a hospital, the same white or black garb figure stands at the center, holding power over body, mind, or soul. So, and we also have missionaries. Together they formed a visual ideology. White is good, right, trustworthy, destined to lead. And so in the colonial uses of whiteness, missionaries in white robes presented Christianity as a pure faith, converting religious indigenous people. They arrived in white coats, bringing civilization, medicine, and progress. And they were also white people, claiming they were bringing order to the dark lands. This combination made it psychologically easier to say, we are pure, we are advanced, we are chosen. You are savage, backward, unclean. Give us your land, labor, and loyalty. White as a moral weapon. It wasn't just about race, it was about legitimizing power. White equals clean, black equals dirty. Colonial propaganda framed colonized people as dirty or primitive, needing cleansing. White showed civilization, dark showed chaos, used to justify conquest, forced education, and resource extraction. White science claimed objectivity while classifying humans into hierarchies. Eugenics and scientific racism came into the picture. So the white face and white garment create a totally visual authority. A priest in white speaks for God. A judge in a white wig speaks for the law. Doctors or scientists in white coats speak for nature or objective truth. Colonial effects in white speaks for civilization and progress. It's not just about persuasion, it's performance. And for centuries, this performance worked across continents, convincing entire populations to surrender land, wealth, and autonomy. So, over and over again, the patterns repeat. The 1500s to the conquistadores and missionaries, they civilized the Americas. In the 1800s, white-jacketed explorers and colonial administrators carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference. 1900s, Western development projects and public health campaigns continue the same pattern under a humanitarian mask. Today, global white-coated experts tell nations what to do with land, energy, health policy, often linked to IMF or World Bank conditions. White is not just a color, it is a code. When worn on the body and embodied in the skin, it has been used as a combination, symbol of moral purity and racial superiority and intellectual authority. This makes conquest, exploitation, and control seem not just permissible, but benevolent for their own good. And this is such a powerful and disturbing image when you place yourself in that scenario. An African village in the 16 or 1800s, a white-skinned stranger in white clothing, armed with strange weapons and tools, must have seemed like a supernatural figure rather than just a man. In many traditional African societies, white was not the color of everyday clothing. It was often reserved for rituals, funerals, or was impractical because it stains easily. So the arrival of white-skinned, white-clothed strangers had a shocking psychological effect. For some remote communities, seeing a pale face for the first time was startling, even interpreted as ghostly or ancestral spirits returning. White fabric was exotic, a luxury material, difficult to keep clean in dusty or muddy environments. Guns, metal tools, and mirrors seemed like magic to those without experience of industrial tech. This created an aura of power. These strangers looked and acted like they were from another world. Missionaries and colonial officers often deliberately dressed in white linen or khaki, projecting cleanliness, order, and civilization. They used marching in formation, military theatrics, firing guns in the air, showing cannons, intended to awe villagers into compliance before a battle even began. Later, white-coated doctors distributed medicine, conducted vaccinations, reinforced the idea that these outsiders held knowledge that could heal or curse. This made it easier to demand tribute, land, labor, or to recruit locals into colonial armies. So white can be seen as a civilizing color, because in Europe, white was already a symbol of purity, the church rituals, power, the ermine-lined royal cloaks, reason and enlightenment, white marble statues, white wigs. When exported to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, it became the color of conquest and progress. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a theatrical shock event designed to overwhelm and reframe reality. White equals God's chosen. Missionaries said they were bringing the true faith. White equals knowledge. Doctors said they were bringing modern medicine. White equals law. Colonial administrators enforced justice under European rule. In every case, the color white reinforced the idea. These people are different, superior, clean, authoritative. The choice of white clothing was not just practical, it was symbolic psychological warfare. It turned conquest into theater. The villagers weren't just defeated militarily, they were enchanted, made to believe they were witnessing a higher order of reality, and that belief made it easier to surrender land, resources, or sovereignty without constant open rebellion. So, one thing that I didn't explain in the reincarnation thing that I want to move into a little bit deeper here, because I thought India also believed in reincarnation. It sort of does, sort of doesn't. But here's the separation. Egyptians and Romanis are the only two in the entire world who believe in the belief of reincarnation. So, only those two groups. And I don't have it written down here. What it is that the pure theory of reincarnation is just that we're reborn, and the Indians have all these other theories that intertwine with all that. So, technically speaking, true believers of pure reincarnation are only the Egyptians and the Romani gypsies, right? So, yeah, and that's where the white coloring of just the skin and the clothing made a big difference in how they presented all these people and all these robes and stuff, right? So this is where it was different. The Egyptians saw life, death, and rebirth as a cycle, not a one-way journey. So this other group, this Ka and Ba, they believed the soul had multiple parts, Ka, Ba, and Aka, that could survive death and reunite in the afterworld. Well, I gotta move. I'm getting lost here, so let me just move on here. But anyway, so I have it down below. Specifically, only two of them believe in reincarnation. Because the Indians, let me see, people from India is actually the biggest global center of reincarnation belief. And Buddhism, along with Hinduism and Jainism, is one of the main traditions that spread the idea worldwide, but they don't believe in one part of it, and I'm too lost to keep going on that right now. Let me just keep moving along here. They say the Romani people originated in northern India around 1,000 years ago, before they migrated to Persia, Byzantine, and eventually Europe. Yeah, I don't know. I gotta move along. Already talking about reincarnation. Okay. And we've had this stuff around us all along. The original founding of the UN, talked about this years ago. It was founded in 1922 by Alice Bailey and her husband, Foster Bailey. The original name, Lucifer Publishing Company. They openly used this name in the early 1920s, Lucifer Publishing Company. Within a few years, I think it was a bridge too far, they changed it to the Lucis Trust in 1925, and that is the reason that they changed the name. Let me see, they changed it just 4 or 5 years after. Yeah, they were getting quite bold there with Lucifer Trust, right? So let's talk about a pogrom. Before I get to the next section, we need to understand specifically what a pogrom is, because when I get back with I hope the final part of this story, when all these people moved from the Eastern Europe over to Israel, they moved because of these pogroms, okay? What is a pogrom? It's P-O-G-R-O-M. It is targeted violence. I would say it is a complete psyops, okay? Pogroms are armed, aimed at a minority group, historically, when often Jewish communities. It involves mobs or large groups, not just isolated individuals. So what happens during a pogrom is a bunch of people get together, they loot homes and businesses, synagogues, or cultural sites, they get vandalized or burned. They kill and assault people, and it often ends in injuries and deaths. So during pogroms, local officials frequently look the other way or even encourage the violence. So where did the first pogrom come from? Well, interesting story. They claim pogroms came from before, but keep this in mind as we travel down this road of who are these people. In Kiev, Ukraine, 1881 was not the first pogrom. It was simply part of the first Russian wave that gave rise to the word pogrom. 1881 in Kyiv, Ukraine. But they claim this. They claim the pogrom happened before that. They claim during the First Crusade in 1096, massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland. Thousands were killed by crusading mobs. That was the first pogrom. Didn't have a name for it then. Then, of course, there was the Black Death, 1347 to 1351. That was what. After the Black Death, there were widespread massacres of Jews accused of poisoning the wells. Hundreds of communities destroyed across Europe. So the Black Death was really a brutal time, and Jews got blamed for everybody dying. Then we had the Spanish expulsion, 1492, also a pogrom. After decades of violence and forced conversions, Jews were expelled from Spain, many killed or dispossessed, along with Romanis, right, during the Spanish one. But these events weren't called pogroms at the time, but they had the same elements: targeted mass violence, often tolerated or encouraged by authorities. So the word pogrom enters common usage in the Russian Empire in Odessa, 1821, 1859, and 1871. There were early anti-Jewish riots which set the stage for later waves, okay? So in 1881 to 1884, the first wave of pogroms, following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Jews were again scapegoated. Pogroms spread across the southwest of the empire, including Kyiv. And there was one in 1903 in the same region, one of the most notorious. 49 Jews were killed, 500 injured, homes and shops destroyed. And then there were some under the 1905 revolution. But anyways, this pogrom in 1881 was the one that they first used the word pogrom, okay? So, and then they had pogroms breaking out in 1941, 1946, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so basically, what happens is these pogroms break out, and then the Jews get blamed for things. These pogroms things happen, right? So they had a big pogrom in Russia, and that caused all of these people to flee Russia, supposedly, to head over to Israel, because they were being so persecuted in Russia, right? Always a story, right? So let's talk a little bit about how does the system keep control of all this stuff, all this history and stuff, right? Well, they use funding and gatekeeping. They use grants and publishing opportunities to steer historians towards safe topics. So they also use peer review. Big controversial claims face higher scrutiny, slowing or killing publication. And by keeping history fragmented, the system prevents dangerous things might challenge official events, because this is how they can control history. Because the public sees history as handled and moves on, believing the story is complete. Meanwhile, the real connecting work, often done by independents, struggles to reach mainstream attention because it lacks the stamp of institutional legitimacy. So we have these dot collectors and the dot connectors, okay? The official system funds the dot collectors to gather safe, disconnected data points, which creates the illusion of a complete history while preventing dangerous connections. This leaves the burden on independent thinkers who are left without funding, credibility, or protection, people like myself. So the dot collectors keep the official record fragmented but safe. The dot connectors, they're needed to see the whole picture, but they lack funding or face stigma. But the public perception is shaped by the funding narrative, making it harder for big connections to break through. They've documented how it started, but they rarely follow through to where it ends or where it was led, especially if that path crosses into military, NATO, or international intelligence system. That's where the dots remain unconnected. What historians have done well: documenting the origin, tracing it back to the Spanish. I'm talking now, I'll give you an example of what historians, Let's talk about the Spanish case with those 300,000 children that were transported out of Spain after World War II through Turkey that were stolen. Well, people have written a lot about those 300,000 children. They know that they were stolen under Franco in Spain. They know how they were stolen, but absolutely nobody has documented what really happened to all those kids. It just, the trail went cold. It's like I've been documenting those orphan train kids. People know that there were lots of kids in the Crusacian area that became orphans. They know a lot of Armenian children became orphans. They know that a lot of movement was happening during that era, but nobody, and I mean nobody, has connected those children to the ones who were actually on those orphan trains, because I've connected them all, and I keep looking and looking and looking, and I keep asking the question, who else is looking? Anybody looking? No, nobody is looking. And I can't figure out why. Well, this is why, because how they fund history is this way. Let's say I want to talk about the orphan trains, and I'm some big university person, right? Well, I talk to my friends in the history department. I say, hey, I want to talk about this orphan train because I think I discovered something new. They'll say, oh, okay, great. Let's help you get some funding for that. Well, then during that process, they can then guide you away from areas they don't want you talking about, right? Well, your work on the orphan train for history would be really important, but I think that we really need to tighten it up a little bit. So how about if we just move past this area over here and into here? And the person says, well, I don't know, that's important. Well, no. We need to get you funding for this. Did you hear what I was asking you? I'm asking you a question about your funding, your livelihood. So if you want your livelihood, then maybe you should think about removing this part. But they say it in much more subtle terms, right? So anyway, so what they do is that some of them have traced it back to the Spanish Civil War and the Spanish kids to the Franco regime. Some of these researchers have showed how it began as a punishment of Republican mothers, then morphed into a legal adoption for ideological cleansing. Some historians have gathered church, hospital, and legal records as far as they still exist. So historians and human rights groups have estimated tens of thousands to 300,000 plus children were affected. Established that this continued into the late 1980s, long past Franco's death. But here's the catch. Almost no published work examined whether children were sent abroad in any systematic way. No significant studies cross-reference NATO air bases, U.S. military archives, or adoption records outside of Spain. Little follow-through on where the children went. Most studies stop at proving they were taken. They rarely frame the thefts within Cold War population control, black ops, or intelligence networks, even though Spain was a key NATO ally. So why does this happen? Well, military or intelligence records may still be classified or inaccessible. So claiming NATO or U.S. Air Force involvement without bulletproof evidence risks career suicide. Funding bias grants favor memory studies, reconciliation projects, and domestic justice, not digging into NATO logistics. Because if you remember from the show I did about Spain, I discovered that my father was on orders from the U.S. Air Force flying children from Spain into Turkey. And that whole thing about my time in Spain has unleashed this whole thing in my tiny little brain right now that I'm still trying to process. Questions come to mind like, why did the U.S. military send all of those families to live in Spain like my family did when they knew that they were stealing children all over the world and they were the ones transporting all of those children? No, I dug through all of the military records. Nobody told my parents that, hey, Spain might be kind of dangerous for you and those kids. Nobody told them that. We had no clue. The military kept it all a secret. But that's because the military, I went to a military school when we were in Spain. The U.S. Department of Defense, or the DOD, runs the military schools. And that is a connection that I totally missed a couple of years ago, which I hope to correct someday soon. How it works is this. The Department of Defense, you know, the people that I've talked endlessly about having all the child pornography on their computers, well, the Department of Defense actually runs all the schools for the military all around the world. And I actually attended Department of Defense schooling when we were in Spain. So between the years of 9 to 12, I was under military schooling. Pretty funny, huh? It's actually not very funny. It's actually kind of insane, but I can't even go there right now. But anyway, so yeah, so that's why they seem to have these memory holes, right? Because if you go to report on this and you need to raise some money to write a book on what I'm talking about, well, I mean, because what happens, the way it works now, is the public only gets part of the narrative. They get, yes, the children were stolen. Yes, it was bad. But the systematic pipeline, where they went, who benefited, whether foreign actors were involved, is left completely blank. This makes the historical work feel complete, but really it is the incomplete and contained, leaving the hardest dots unconnected. Being a historian often means being a dot collector, not a finisher. They give us the beginning of the story, but not the end. So incindependent people have to pull the threads together across borders and institutions, something academia isn't incentivized to do. And I have coined a new phrase: the most effective deception looks like truth-telling. Academia and official history writing often gives the appearance of sincere, honest investigation, which builds public trust, while quietly staying within boundaries that protect powerful institutions. Deceptions by sincerity is what I call it. They appear transparent. They publish studies. They hold conferences. They release carefully chosen archives. This convinces the public that everything is coming to light. They tell the safe part of the story. They focus on domestic actors, bad apples, or systematic failures that are politically safe to blame. They stop short before implicating allies, NATO partners, intelligence agencies, or transnational networks. They close the case. They issue a reconciliation report, a government apology, a memorial. They signal that the issue has been handled and society can move on. Historians and scholars are trusted by the public. They seem objective. Funding, tenure, and peer review steer them towards safe conclusions. I used to actually believe that, but actually peer review means you line up with another pack of psychopath researchers, and what happens is you all agree to help each other's careers indiscreetly, right? So then I approve your peer review, you approve my peer review, you scratch my back, so only the bad apples rise to the top. This is only my opinion. So it provides gatekeeping. Anybody who pushes too far gets labeled unprofessional, speculative, or even conspiratorial. So deception starts to feel like the truth because there is real evidence, real research, and real sincerity. It's just all incomplete. The dangerous parts remain hidden, but the public thinks they've been given the whole picture. Academia appears brave. Look, we investigated Franco's crimes, while quietly leaving NATO, CIA, U.S. Air Force, or Vatican roles unexamined. The best way to pull off deception is to make it look like sincerity and honesty. Academia isn't rewarded for blowing open uncomfortable truths. It's rewarded for producing orderly, politically manageable narratives that satisfy public curiosity without threatening the pillars of the system. When historians, scientists, or officials publish their findings, the public assumes the topic is settled. These are smart, trained people. If there was more to know, they would have found it. So then ordinary people think, well, I'm not a historian. Who am I to question them? I must be imagining connection. The experts would have said something if it were true. This keeps them from pursuing their own research or trusting their own observations. Official reports, books, or documentaries give a feeling of completion. People move on emotionally, thinking injustice or truth has been served, even when it hasn't. Partial truths are powerful because some truth is told. People believe the whole story must have been told. It closes the door before most people even start asking questions. Questioning the experts risks being labeled paranoid, conspiratorial, or anti-intellectual, which discourages dissent. So the effect becomes, well, just relax. The experts have handled it. No need for you to think too hard. I mean, they came right out and said that a few years ago. You shouldn't worry about researching things. We've taken care of this. This is one of the most subtle forms of control, outsourcing truth to authority, so the public stops asking dangerous questions. And because it feels rational to trust the experts, it is incredibly persuasive. It promotes self-censorship as a victory. Governments or trusted institutions put out an official version, a mix of fact, framing, and omission. People internalize it as the safe, reasonable, or educated position. When someone questions it, others react. Who are you to question the experts? Stop spreading conspiracy theories. Social ridicule, ostracism, or fact-checking gets weaponized against dissenters. Now, the state or system doesn't really need to silence anyone. Neighbors, co-workers, or even family members do it for them. People now preemptively stay quiet to avoid social punishment. People and humans fear social rejection more than almost anything. It's a survival instinct. If everyone around you accepts the narrative, it feels dangerous to be the one who questions it. Those in the same class section, academics, journalists, and bureaucrats, often defend the narrative because it protects their credibility and, most importantly, their funding. People stop connecting the dots even when they have evidence. Those who do connect dots are discredited or shunned. The government or powerful network wins without lifting a finger. Propaganda has now become self-sustaining. When the public censors itself and polices others, the system has achieved full spectrum control. Propaganda isn't just working, it's running on autopilot, powered by social pressure and fear of exclusion. Those big, heavy history books, like The Complete Civil War in 3 volumes, Definitive History of X, give the impression of finality, but what they really are is a giant pile of dots, only dots. They describe events, battles, dates, but rarely if ever say, well, here's the bigger picture. Well, here's what this really meant. Here's how power operated and how it still affects you today. The last step, connecting the dots and interpretive meaning, is exactly what's missing. They tell the story in order, battle after battle, law after law, president after president. This satisfies the need for detail, but stops short of pattern recognition. Final chapters might offer a summary, but not a moral or structural conclusion about power. Rarely do they say, well, this war proved elites manipulate both sides, or this was about control of land and labor, and here who's won long term. Historians are trained to avoid judgment, but that leaves readers without a guiding insight, as if history is just a list of facts, not a living system that still shapes today. But it feels complete because it's in 3 volumes, thousands of pages, with maps and footnotes. The reader feels the topic is closed. No urge to connect the dots. Without a strong, final, this is what it means, most readers don't feel they have permission to draw a conclusion, so they leave it at that. People trust that if there was a big takeaway, the historian would have told them. Since they didn't, the reader assumes there is none, or that it's complicated, beyond their reach. This keeps history safe. Facts are laid out, but stripped of dangerous synthesis that might challenge present power-day structures. If readers saw the big picture, systematic exploitation, hidden networks, repeating patterns, they might question today's institutions. The public thinks, well, we already know that what happened. There's nothing left to uncover. Most history books are dot catalogs, not dot maps. They leave readers with information, but not wisdom. The last chapter almost never says, here's how this still affects you today, and here's who benefited. That gap keeps the public passive and disconnected from the ongoing story. I want to give you an example of this orphan train because I'll be back with that down the road here. The orphan train is a great example. Between about 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 plus children were moved by train from eastern cities, especially New York, to rural families in the Midwest. The standard narrative was this: these were street urchins and abandoned children rescued from poverty and crime. The story is usually told as a bittersweet tragedy, harsh but necessary, and then celebrated as an early form of social welfare. Today, countless blogs, TikToks, YouTube channels, and history sites retell this story. Most copy each other, recycling the same few facts: the number of children, the years it happened, the fact that it was a children's aid society, and the Charles Brace's intentions. It's often turned into inspirational content. The kids got a new chance at life. What hardly gets asked: where did all these children come from? That was my big question for all these years. I kept thinking, it's not possible. I look at pictures constantly. I look at every old picture I get my hands on. I would have to be seeing thousands of kids roaming the streets for this to be real, right? It just was not adding up to me. So were there truly hundreds of thousands of kids just roaming New York streets unclaimed? Contemporary police, census, and charity records show large, huge numbers, but those records are rarely scrutinized deeply. Were some of those children taken but poor? Evidence suggests some parents never consented, but this is rarely highlighted. Who benefited economically? The kids provided cheap labor for farms, domestic work for rural households, essentially a supply chain of children. Many were exploited, abused, or worked like indentured servants. This is often mentioned, but not fully investigated. So why does this narrative stay safe? Well, because outrage and tragedy drives clicks. So the sad but safe version is repeated over and over. Digging into systematic child supply chains, forced removals, and labor exploitation would require expensive research and might anger powerful historical institutions. People want to feel sad but reassured. Yes, it was hard, but it was charity. The darker implication that there may have been organized child extraction on a massive scale is too unsettling for casual readers. So what happens is the effect on the public understanding. So now everyone knows about the orphan trains, but they only know the curated version. The story stays in the past, safely tragic, with no pressure to re-examine what it means for today's foster system, trafficking, or adoption practices. It keeps the public from asking the next question: was this truly charity or a system of taking children from the vulnerable to supply cheap labor? Fragmented coverage gives people just enough to feel informed, but not enough to question the system. When hundreds of social posts echo the same tragic orphan train story, it becomes accepted truth. But very few historians or journalists go back to the raw data: police reports, immigration reports, records, court cases, parish registers. Without the work, the street waif theory stands unchallenged, even when common sense says thousands of truly abandoned children should have been noticed and documented in much more detail. So let me give you a few examples. There are literally dozens of books under the orphan train on Goodreads, a list of over 50 books. Historical fiction and nonfiction books included Orphan Train Writer, Orphan Train. Some series like the Orphan Train Saga were 18-book historical fiction saga. The Orphan Train on PBS, a well-known documentary episode. West by Orphan Train documentary about children sent westward. There is also a video segment collection and archival film resources from the National Orphan Train Complex. A TV movie called Orphan Train in 1979 based on the Orphan Train movement. There are many children's books, Orphan Trains Taking the Rails to a New Life, a fictional series aimed at young readers. So, based on the Goodreads list and Amazon, there's likely between 50 to 100 books, fiction and nonfiction, that treat the orphan train story as a main focus. Many are republished, reprinted, and or fictionalized accounts. There's probably been 5 to 15 major TV productions, PBS, primetime, streaming, feature documentaries that present the history of the orphan trains in a mainstream way. There's been thousands of smaller articles, blogs, local history pieces, newspaper retrospectives, essays. Of these, only a few delve into archives or propose deeper new interpretation. I myself did a show about the orphan trains about 4 years ago. I have not stopped looking since then. So most shows and books repeat the same basic outline. Children from eastern cities, orphaned or homeless, sent west, placed with rural families. Fewer works examine the consent or biology of the parents, differences between street children versus children removed by social pressure, oversight, abuse, or morality rates, economic incentives, labor exploitation behind placements, detailed records of where specific children ended up, tracing family histories. The story is very well known and often told. It's in many books and in media, so it's part of public consciousness. But well known does not mean fully understood, because many works do not push into deeper, more controversial, or less documented dots. Because the basics are repeated, people often assume we already know everything, which slows or stops fresh investigations. Still, the standard social history digs into how, placed out, worked out, organized it. So yeah, so people, I've got the list of the books, the different documentaries down below. Yeah, it's one of these things that everybody knows about it, right? But they call these kids, what they call them, street orphans and Arabs, street Arabs, yeah, I got it right. Okay, so, yeah, so universities, engineering associations, and official investigative agents do not train people to look for these signatures as standard procedures, so they don't look to draw these connections, right? So it's like, for example, I've talked endlessly about thermite. Well, people now know that thermite was discovered on the scene of 9/11, but very few people have bothered to look any further. Thermite has been used at 9/11. It's been used at San Francisco. That was really thermite. It wasn't an earthquake. It was used in Japan. It was used in Lahaina, Hawaii. Thermite is always used to blow things up. But what happens is that even with thermite, they talk about it like it was just one event, when it's really not. So when the evidence emerges, it gets siloed. Historians and investigators rarely take the next step. If this was here, maybe it's been used elsewhere, because doing so would risk funding, reputation, and challenging powerful narratives. So the public will never learn to think of thermite as a typical tool of sabotage or covert action. It stays in the realm of conspiracy theory, not standard forensic science. When it comes to child exploitation, whether the Baka Bazi boys in Afghanistan or the dancing boys of the Ottoman Empire, it is almost always treated as a local curiosity or a cultural quirk, not part of a long historical continuum. Historians do write about these practices, but they usually stay narrowly focused, describing Afghanistan or the Ottomans or Rome without tracing the line back to Egypt and showing how it was normalized over millennia. I'll get back to you with more, but just as an example, these Baka Bazi boys in Afghanistan. It has been well documented by NGOs, journalists, and even some U.S. military reports because many soldiers were disturbed by it. Typically framed as a unique Afghan tradition, a problem of backward culture, not part of a global pattern. But the deeper question, who protects these networks? Who profits? Why do they persist through regimes? Rarely asked in academic works. Because the Persian boy dancers were also written as part of the Ottoman entertainment culture. And that's often described in neutral, anthropological language, courtly pastime. And this is what they do. They make the boys dance and they sexually exploit them. But what they do is they clothe it in other language and they say, well, this was really a courtly pastime or a dancing tradition without moral judgment or connection to present day exploitation. Like pederasty in Athens is studied extensively, but usually as a social educational practice, not primarily as exploitation. Scholars debate ethics, but again, rarely connect it to modern equivalents. In ancient Egypt, there were temple dancers, musicians, and child servants are mentioned, but sexual exploitation is downplayed or treated as speculative. Very few historians attempt to map Egypt's influence on Greek ritual dance and youth culture in a way that explains continuity. No major historical synthesis says child ritual dance or elite exploitation is a continuous tradition from Egypt through Greece, Rome, the Ottoman Empire, and into modern Afghanistan. That would be a bold, cross-disciplinary argument requiring Egyptologists, classicists, Islamic historians, and modern anthropologists to collaborate, which rarely happens. So by isolating each case as local custom, the global pattern is hidden. It becomes easier for governments or occupying powers to excuse or tolerate abuse by saying, well, it's just their tradition. Survivors lose their chance to be seen as part of a long history of systematic exploitation. Their suffering remains provincially. So the story of these boys is rarely completed. Historians describe what happened, but stop short of asking why does this pattern repeat across empires and centuries? What does that say about power, control, and how elites use children? Who benefits from allowing it to continue even under modern military oversight? Until someone connects those dots across time and geography, the story stays fractured, and the abuse keeps hiding behind the label of local custom. Yeah, basically what they do, and I'll have the whole story of the dancing boys in Afghanistan. I don't want to hide the bottom line. The bottom line is this: it happened because of the warlords. And you have to learn to drill down for questions. They're blaming the dancing sexual abuse of those boys in Afghanistan on the warlords, and it is a disgusting story how it all got started and overlooked, and I'm too tired and riled up to go today. But yes, behind those dancing boys and the sexual exploitation of those children, the U.S. government 100% is behind it. 100%. They are the ones who are making this dancing boys happen. So they don't follow the thread forward to Rome, the Ottomans, and modern practices like those Bacha Bazi boys. They don't call it a continuity of elite access to children. They avoid moral framing, focusing instead on art, dance forms, and religious meanings. Very few historians and classics have traced Egyptian influence on Greek ritual on dance, but they treat it as a cultural transmission, not a chain of exploitation. They don't carry the thread forward to show how the pattern reemerges in later empires. No mainstream historian has put all the dots together in a single narrative about how elites have used ritual, dance, and youth culture as a cover for access to children across time. So the clip that's going to play is this. Pre-1948, there were militias called the Haganah, Urguan, and Lehi. Aren't you glad I'm not telling this story? That's why I'm not well enough to fumble through this story, so I wisely found a brilliant group of people who put this all together for us, and it's going to play in a minute. But what it is, this narrative ties together massacres, bombing of the King David Hotel, and the forced depopulation leading to the creation of Israel. And it highlights how leaders of those militias, Menachem Begin, Shamir, David Ben-Gurion, became prime ministers and shaped state policy. So it was a propaganda and the most moral army branding. The argument is that Israel's official history reframed these violent origins as heroism and restraint, creating a myth of moral exceptionalism for the IDF. So, mainstream Israeli and Western historians often treat each militia action as a separate event, or focus on just one group, like a book on the Urgur or a study of the Haggah. There are Israeli new historians, but anyway, so I'm going to not keep fumbling, but so we have dot collectors. Those are official historians, military archivists, document each incident in isolation. The dot connectors, the investigative journalists, revisionist histories, stitch them together in a narrative that shows continuity, militias, and state army, and ongoing military doctrine. When someone tells the whole story end to end, including massacres, terror tactics, political assassinations, it challenges the moral branding of the IDF, and those voices often face backlash, marginalization, and accusations of bias. The branding of the IDF as the most moral army in the world works precisely because most people have never seen full historical arc laid out in one place. By telling the story from pre-1948 militias to present-day policies, you cut through the fragmented history and show it as a single continuum. This is a complete dot-connecting exercise in this clip. It links underground militias, political terrorism, ethnic cleansing, and state formation into a single thread. So it's really going to be the timeline of from underground militias to the state, Israeli state, and the IDF. And I'm going to let the show do its talking for me. And it is, like I said, it is pretty crazy when you take a look at all of the stuff that they did to build up to the state of Israel. They literally brought in thugs is what they did, right? Seeing this as a setup is not unreasonable. It's a pattern of revolutionary groups becoming the government, because these groups that started all this terror in Israel pre-becoming a state became the government. So it really shows a lot. So essentially the dot collectors write each battle, riot, or assassinations as a footnote. Dot connectors lay out the whole chain, and suddenly it looks like an intentional pipeline to power, not just random stuff. The whole idea of this is to create so much fear that our brains switch off. So the storyline that we all get told these things. They say things like, well, now with this new thing, we're going to be able to have a lot more surveillance of you people because we got to keep you under control. So, and they always come up, and I want to give you one example. They always come up with these big fearful things, right? Well, we're going to put cameras on every corner, and we're going to be watching your every move, and before you know it, you're going to be out. We're going to have you down at the police department. Well, many of these fear machines have very basic weaknesses. Did you know that you can point a laser pointer or a bright light can blind cameras or targeting sensors? Were you aware that reflecting materials like metal sheets, foil, can scatter or block the beams? Were you aware that walls of smoke or fog break line of sight systems? Did you know you could have clothing that shields designs where millimeter waves can drastically reduce the effect? So, a clever person with cheap tools can frustrate a lot of very expensive tech. The bigger and more dramatic a claim, the harder it is for people to imagine that someone would ever make it up, so many accept it. When governments or institutions present a grand narrative, this tech will make war humane. This is the most advanced weapon ever. It sounds both awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time. Fear becomes self-sustaining. If people can't independently verify the claim, their imagination fills in the worst-case scenario. When detail leaks or cause controversy, we often hear very neat, simple explanations that almost sound too easy. It was just a test. We got the transition wrong. That's not really what it means, it's symbolic. This is what you call out with the Luciferian means light bringer explanation. It's technically true, but feels dismissive and doesn't address why the name was used in the first place. For example, like that second snake we had on the medical logo. Mistakes or oops moments are sometimes used as an escape hatch. If someone stirs fear or controversy, authorities say it was a misunderstanding or error. This allows them to calm the public without revealing much more. Ironically, this can make mistrust worse because people feel manipulated or patronized. But this is what happens. They did not bother to figure out psychologically who we are. They put a bunch of tests on us. They learned how to saw off somebody's leg and attach it to their arm, all kinds of horrific sadomasochistic things. But they really psychologically do not know at the core who we are. We are not them. For the believers, the big lie locks it in. They double down because the official walk back sounds fake. For skeptics, the walk back sounds proof there is something to hide. For the general public, most just accept the simple explanation because it's easier and less scary than questioning everything. So the bottom line is this: it is all fear thrives in the gap between what we're told and what we can verify. The outside world becomes unpredictable and frightening. The inside world becomes the place where quiet compliance takes place. People may not even realize they've traded freedom for the illusion of safety. They feel like they've made the choices themselves. And what do? Well, they withdraw socially. It keeps them passive and easy to monitor. Silent background pressure maintains control without visible conflict. It turns our homes, which should be a sanctuary, into the primary arena of control. While everybody is running outside looking at those chemtrails, no one is considering the dirty electricity that is permeating all of our homes. And if you are thinking, well, I'm in a country that we don't have smart meters yet, so just you Americans are getting it first. Well, yeah, we are getting it first. That is very true. The U.S. has over 80% smart meter installation. England and those places about 50%. Just because you don't have a smart meter does not mean you are not getting zapped. Let's make this very, very clear. If you are in the UK area, this is just my guess. Your area was the first area they lied about putting in one of these power plants for plutonium, right? So they lied about that plant in your own country, right? So you don't think it's possible, not possible in your mind, that they're creating dirty electricity that they're pumping into your homes. The smart meter only accelerates the dirty electricity, but everybody is getting hit with dirty electricity if you have technology in your space. So just because you don't have a smart meter does not mean you're not going to be getting the impact. We're getting close to winter now. You need to have those windows open, staying what happens when we feel depressed or we want to escape things, we retreat to our homes, we close ourselves in. That is the last thing we should be doing. You need fresh air. And I have got to close this show. The clip will play today. The clip will play now. And I'll return with the final story of when these people moved after those pogroms down into Israel. But first we need to know the setup of how this all happened. So, and I have these other cases, these orphan trains and stuff already figured out, and it is very, very sad story. And when you look around at other people, try not to judge. You do not know what is behind that person's mind. You do not know what their background is. You only know what you heard. Many people in this country have been abused and experimented on, and they absolutely do not know. I'm hoping to get back to the Department of Defense show soon, because I feel like I need to do that after this next show, because people are still sending their children to those schools. And yeah, I need to be in the right space to talk about all of that. But yeah, right now, the Department of Defense is now in all these countries. It has access to all of these children. So it's still going on right now, today, in real time. Children are being used all around the world as part of this whole thing, because the Department of Defense also has camera facilities. I mean, they have it all. I mean, I mentioned this in the past. Nobody but me wonders about where all those pictures from YouTube end up. They are monetizing those somehow, and they are monetizing them through this whole trick they're doing over in Amsterdam right now. I can't even get a handle on the amount of money that's being swished around and taken away from tax dollars. You know, money that your children could use to take care of them and stuff. That, oh, we don't have money for your children's health care. They are robbing us blind by sending all of this tech stuff. The tech bros are dark, evil people, and be safe out there. And goodbye for now. I'll talk to you as soon as I can. So, sorry the show was a little bit ragged today, but hey, that's the new normal for me. So I'm just trying to adapt as I go along. So be safe out there, and goodbye for now. I keep trying to shut it off, but it's not working. Let me see here. Okay, here we go.
The Israeli Defense Force, Israel's well-funded and high-tech army, is the most moral army in the world. That is, if you believe the branding.
צה"ל הוא הצבא המוסרי ביותר בעולם.
The most moral army in the world.
The IDF is a moral army.
The most moral.
The moralist.
The IDF does more to safeguard the rights of civilians than any other army in the history of warfare.
But apart from the allegations of war crimes in Gaza, the attempts to paint it as an animal-friendly, queer-friendly, religiously tolerant military institution, the history of the IDF says more about it than its social media image. Before the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, and before there was an Israeli army, there were three underground Zionist militias: the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi. They were comprised of mainly Jewish migrants to the British Mandate of Palestine, with the aim of helping usher in the Jewish state by any means necessary. They differed in their tactics and beliefs, and at times fought with each other, but together they terrorized Palestinian villages, committed acts of violence, terrorism, and ethnic cleansing, and executed bombings and assassinations against the British to force them to give up control of the land. They blew up hotels in Jerusalem, embassies in Europe, and assassinated a UN mediator. All of this happened before 1948, because after Israel was officiated as a state, these three groups would be brought together to create the IDF, and their militia leaders would go on to form Israel's government, become politicians, ambassadors, and prime ministers. And their dark history would be forgotten. So, let's talk about it. Let's begin at the turn of the 20th century. Europe was embroiled in revolution, war, and great social upheaval. Anti-Semitism had been rife for centuries in Europe, but attacks against Jewish communities had become widespread, particularly in Russia. While most attempted to flee to the United States, around 30,000 Russian Jews migrated to Palestine from 1882 to 1904, then under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. These communities were known as the New Yishuv, and they built small self-reliant settlements independent of the old Yishuv, who consisted mostly of Arab Jews who'd migrated to Jerusalem over centuries, mostly for religious practice. Unlike the old Yeshuv, the new Yeshuv were driven by a new ideology that was growing popular among European Jews as well as some influential Christian figures: Zionism.
And the basis of Zionism was the belief that the Jewish question, as it was called in Europe, in other words, a place of Jews, given the rising anti-Semitism, could only be solved territorially, that is, by establishing a state of their own. And from very early on, that state had to be in Palestine, because that way you could use religious legitimacy to justify what was settler colonialism.
The new Yeshuv were ambitious. They built farms, formed trade unions and councils to purchase land from Palestinians. They also began to form small militias, seeking to replace hired Arab watchmen with Jewish guards to protect the new outposts. Some of these militias, like Bar Giora, had bigger plans. Its members wanted to create the beginnings of an underground army, one that would one day serve a future Jewish state, and fight for one if need be. One of its founders was a young Polish laborer called David Grun, who migrated to Palestine in 1906. He was shocked at how many Palestinian Arabs worked in the new settler colonies as farmers and guards, and set about trying to build connections between migrants and fundraise to ensure the Yeshuv would become completely self-reliant. This included more money to buy weapons. Like many other Jewish migrants, he later adopted a Hebrew last name and would hence be known as David Ben-Gurion. We'll come back to him. By 1909, militias like Bar Giora began to evolve into larger networks, the most prominent being Hashimer, or the Watchmen. Despite only having a few dozen members, Hashimer began to think of itself as guarding not only the colonies and properties set up by the new Yeshuv, but as a vigilante force that would respond to disputes. If a Jewish person was attacked by a Palestinian, Hashimer would send its armed members to seek revenge. They were inspired by Ukrainian Cossacks and, interestingly, Palestinian Bedouins. They rode on horseback and even dressed in kufiyas. Weird, right? In his book Orientalism and the Hebrew Imagination, historian Yaron Peleg says the young Zionists wanted to recreate the image of the Jewish man and reject the anti-Semitic tropes of Jews as weak and passive. In the new Yeshuv, they focused on farming and fighting as ways to build stronger, more self-reliant men, what Zionist leader Max Nordau described as muscular Judaism. And while they drew inspiration from the agricultural Arabs they saw around them, they no longer wanted to rely on Palestinian laborers and guards in their settlements. The Jewish state of the future had to rely on a Jewish workforce, and eventually a Jewish army. At this point, the total Jewish population of Palestine was around 60,000 and accounted for only about 7% of the population, with many of the earlier Russian migrants going back home once the situation had eased. But by the end of World War I, everything had changed. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Palestine was taken over by the British Army. Lord Arthur Balfour, himself a Christian Zionist and Foreign Secretary, signed the Balfour Declaration, promising to create a Jewish state in mandatory Palestine. This led to a bigger wave of migration to the new Yeshuv, and up to 100,000 Jewish migrants arrived from Eastern Europe in the decade following the war. By now, the local Palestinian Arab population were starting to feel like something was amiss. Were outraged at the Balfour Declaration, and many of them saw it as a European plot to colonize Arab land. House purchases in Jerusalem and Hebron were increasing, as were the construction of Jewish kibbutzes and settlements. But what pushed tensions to the brink was the increased religious activity around the Western Wall and Al-Aqsa compound, which some radical voices were arguing should be under total Jewish control. This spilled over into riots and general strikes targeting British and Jewish outposts, which escalated into communal fighting in 1920 and 1921. For the Zionist leaders, it proved that the local paramilitary groups needed to be better organized and better equipped to protect the new Yeshuv. This led to the establishment of the Haganah, or the defense, which formed from the Hashimer recruits, as well as an influx of soldiers who had served in Jewish regiments in the British Army during World War I. They smuggled in more advanced weapons from abroad, and by the 1930s, the majority of Jewish settlers were enlisted, and the paramilitary group became the foundation of the new Yishuv. The Haganah now resembled what the Bar Giora had once dreamt up, an underground army fighting for the promise of a Jewish state. Initially, they coordinated and at times fought alongside the British against Palestinian Arab rioters in small skirmishes. The worst of these happened in 1929, when a rumor spread to Hebron that 2 Palestinians had been killed in the holy city of Jerusalem, and that a plot was underway to take Al-Aqsa. A riot ensued, targeting Jewish homes and synagogues. There were only 700 Jews in Hebron at the time, and many were sheltered by Palestinian families until the fighting ended, but by that time at least 50 Jewish settlers had been killed. The militants began to feel that the small British military presence was reluctant to fight the Palestinians, and resentment began to grow within their ranks. Some still looked to the British for protection, but others saw them as merely an obstacle to statehood that needed to move out of the way by force if necessary. Remember David Ben-Gurion? He'd now become the de facto leader of the new Yishuv as the president of the Jewish Agency, working with the British to protect Jewish interests and to shut down calls for unity with Palestinians. But Ben-Gurion didn't want to confront the Arabs head-on, not at this stage at least. He also didn't want to create problems with his British allies and instituted a policy of havlaga, restraint. Under his watch, the Haganah forces would only be deployed to protect Jewish settlements, not launch offenses against Palestinian villages. At least, not for another few years. In a letter he would later write to his son in 1937, Ben-Gurion made his intentions pretty clear. Quote, "We must expel the Arabs and take their places. And, if we have to use force, not to dispossess the Arabs of the Negev and the Transjordan, but to guarantee our own right to settle in those places, then we have force at our disposal." Ben-Gurion's focus was back on Europe, where the tides of anti-Semitism were rising to unprecedented levels. With the emergence of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, it became clear that more efforts were needed to transfer as many Jews to Palestine as possible. Over the next decade, 250,000 European Jews would flee to Palestine, pushing existing tensions to a boiling point. The divisions within the Haganah were growing as well, between those who followed Ben-Gurion's lead and another group of revisionist Zionists, who not only felt that the British were getting in the way of the dream of creating a greater Israel over the whole of the Mandate of Palestine, but who also believed that this greater Israel should extend to all of Jordan and parts of Lebanon and Syria. But to make this dream a reality, they needed to put an end to Palestinian resistance on their own terms, without waiting for orders from the British or even Ben-Gurion, whose policy of restraint failed to convince the most hardline young Zionists. So they took matters into their own hands, splintering from the Haganah, and formed their own paramilitary group, the Irgun. The Irgun was led by a number of defected Haganah senior commanders, including, most significantly, the writer Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the founder of revisionist Zionism, and had been active in Jewish defense efforts in the Russian Federation before going on to found one of the Jewish regiments in the British Army with the aim of fighting against the Ottomans in Palestine. In a paper he published in 1923 entitled The Iron Wall, Jabotinsky outlined his fundamental disagreements with Ben-Gurion and the other moderate Zionists, who he called vegetarians and peacemongers. Quote, "Our peacemongers are trying to persuade us that the Arabs are either fools whom we can deceive by masking our real aims, or that they are corrupt and can be bribed to abandon to us their claim to priority in Palestine. We may tell them whatever we like about the innocence of our aims, watering them down and sweetening them with honeyed words to make them more palatable, but they know what we want." Jabotinsky believed that all native populations resist colonists, and that the only way to deal with them was by creating an iron wall of force that couldn't be penetrated. With his ideas, the new militia began to grow from dozens to thousands, with an emblem that represented their ambitions to expand to all of historic Palestine as well as Transjordan. They initially fought strategically alongside the Haganah and the British, but that would change in 1936, when a Palestinian uprising would push them to take matters into their own hands.
Unrest in Palestine. Suspecting that the Higher Committee had incited Arab leaders to start a holy war against the British government, police swooped on the secret headquarters of assassins and rebels. Many arrests were made.
It was called the Great Revolt. Furious at Britain's support for Zionism, the growing population of armed settlers, and the crippling economic impacts of the Great Depression, the Palestinians attempted to overthrow British occupation, and with it, end the attempts of dividing their land. It began with a series of general strikes from mostly farmers, but soon the rebellion began to take structure, with armed rebels forming platoons and appointing leaders. But they were up against 2 British regiments, making up around 20,000 soldiers, as well as an armed and trained Jewish Guard force and Haganah and Irgun forces that together made up tens of thousands of armed militiamen. In short, they were outnumbered and certainly outgunned. The uprising lasted for 3 years, ultimately failed, with British forces, the Haganah and Irgun, often fighting alongside each other to crush the Arab revolt, killing thousands and razing entire villages. Irgun militants planted explosives and landmines in public spaces and engaged in shootouts with Arab guards. Seeing the situation spiraling out of its control, and with another war brewing in Europe, Britain passed the White Paper in 1939, which implemented for the first time strict limits on Jewish migration, allowing for only 75,000 new migrants over 5 years. This was the final straw for Jabotinsky and the revisionists. They saw it as a betrayal, proof that the best way to protect Jewish interests in Palestine was to go on the offensive, and that their biggest threat wasn't the Palestinians, it was the British, who they now regarded as an occupying force that needed to be expelled. By this time, Jabotinsky himself had been exiled back to Europe by the British, who were concerned about his growing influence. There he began to formulate a plan, recruiting and training small underground cells in Poland that would first help evacuate as many as 1.5 million European Jews and sneak them and himself into Palestine illegally, bypassing the White Paper's restrictions. Together with one of the Irgun's leaders back in Palestine, a Polish Zionist named Avraham Stern, they recruited 40,000 Jewish militants and began smuggling handguns, rifles, explosives, and ammunition with the intention of launching their own revolt against the British. Stern even penned an anthem for the Irgun called Unknown Soldiers, a song that called on Jews to join the underground militias and die for their cause. But the outbreak of World War II would put the Irgun's plans of a great Jewish revolt on hold. Seeing the rise of Hitler and the systemic persecution of Jews in Poland, Germany, and later France, Jabotinsky offered to lend the British his trained Jewish militants to fight against the Nazis, the same way he'd done during World War I. A year later, he died of a heart attack while visiting a training camp in New York. But that decision to assist the British in the war would divide the Irgun and its remaining leaders, who were now in British detention camps, of what direction to take the militia. Avraham Stern decided to split from the group and form his own militia, the Lehi, or Stern Gang, and tried to raise funds by robbing British banks, which were almost never successful. Stern's ideas were even more radical than Jabotinsky's. He advocated for the expulsion or complete annihilation of Palestinians, describing Jews as a master race and Arabs as a slave race. He and his group of small but fevered followers referred to themselves as terrorists, who believed that acts of terror were justified to reach their aims. Stern was so obsessed with fighting the British that in 1941 he wrote to Nazi authorities, pledging to fight alongside Hitler against the British if he agreed to help establish a Jewish state in Palestine.
He wanted to fight the British in order to gain independence. Stern, in his utter naivety, believed he could form an alliance with Hitler against the British.
He wanted to make an agreement with the Nazis so that the Nazis will send or let the Jews from Europe come here to Israel and be safe. And in addition, the Lehi will help the Germans by fighting the British.
But the Nazis never wrote back. Eventually, Stern was killed while attempting to flee an arrest warrant by British police, and while his group never gained the dominance he wished, it would continue to wield a significant impact on the events over the next few years. Meanwhile, as the horrors of World War II unfolded, David Ben-Gurion became engaged in the efforts to continue the illegal immigration of Jewish refugees to Palestine. Taking advantage of a distracted Britain, he employed the Haganah to organize a continuous fleet of vessels across the Mediterranean to sneak in thousands to the new Yishuv communities. By this point, there were close to 450,000 Jewish migrants in Palestine, though the British continued to restrict further official avenues for migration. And as the realities of the extent of the Holocaust were coming into light, the Zionists in the Irgun, who'd put aside their differences to fight alongside the British, were outraged and determined to take control of Palestine once and for all. By 1944, a young, devout follower of Ze'ev Jabotinsky had taken control of the militia. His name was Menachem Begin, and in 1944 declared an open rebellion against the British mandate, orchestrating a series of bombings on immigration offices in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. He then went after the tax offices, then the police stations. The Lehi joined in, taking part in a series of increasingly brazen attacks on British police officers, which eventually led to the assassination of Britain's Minister of State for the Middle East. On the 6th of November, Walter Edward Guinness, also known as Lord Moyne, was shot by two Lehi operatives outside his home in Cairo. His death sent shockwaves throughout the region and put the Zionist fight for control of Palestine on the world stage. Lehi and Irgun accused Lord Moyne of being one of the architects of the White Paper and used his death to send a message to Winston Churchill. One of Lehi's leaders and the brains behind the assassination, Yitzhak Shamir, later explained this in an interview.
He was against any Jewish aliyah, any Jewish immigration. He didn't believe that there exists such a thing like a Jewish nation or a Jewish people, and therefore we decided to make this operation.
It would not be Shamir's last assassination. Britain, still embroiled in the war, leaned on Ben-Gurion and Zionist leaders to quell the attacks, and the Haganah began going after Irgun and Lehi members, killing or detaining thousands of them in a period that would later be referred to as the hunting season. Fearing an outbreak of civil war, Menachem Begin instructed his militants to stand down, knowing that their actions had proven popular among the Jewish population in the Yishuv, and his plan paid off. Within months, anger at the Haganah's continued collaboration with the British forced the Zionist leaders to back down and join forces with Begin and the Stern Gang to launch a united Jewish resistance movement. The alliance between the three paramilitary groups escalated the attacks against the British and began to target vital infrastructure around Palestine: railroads, bridges, prisons, and police stations. It was now widely believed among the Yishuv that the British had betrayed their promise of a Jewish state, and that immigration restrictions had to be overturned to accommodate for the large population of refugees fleeing the end of World War II. But the alliance had to remain secret to protect the standing of Zionist leaders in Europe, a secret that was exposed in 1946 during Operation Agatha, sometimes referred to as Black Sabbath. The British conducted sweeping raids of Jewish settlements, arresting thousands of Zionist activists and militants, and obtaining a trove of documents that proved the Jewish agency, including David Ben-Gurion and the Haganah, were now working with the Lehi and the Irgun, both of whom were considered terrorist organizations. The raid infuriated the militants and threatened the fragile alliance. In retaliation, Menachem Begin ordered the Irgun to carry out an operation on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was the base of the British Secretariat and where the confiscated documents were kept. On July 22, 1946, Irgun operatives placed a 350-kilogram bomb in the basement of the hotel, blowing up its southern wing and killing 91 people. Of them, 41 were Palestinians, 28 were British citizens, and 17 were Jews. The shock of the attack forced the Haganah to retreat once again, and Britain escalated its crackdown on Zionist activists. But the Irgun and Lehi persisted with their operations, targeting British police in assassinations and kidnappings and branching out into Europe. 3 months later, they blew up the British embassy building in Italy. Then in January 1947, Lehi operatives drove a truck full of explosives into a British police station in Haifa, It was called the world's first truck bomb. Then in March of that year, they blew up a British colonial club in London. Weary from the aftermath of World War II and struggling to control fighting in most of its colonies, Britain appealed to the newly formed United Nations to find a solution to the situation in Palestine. The UN, then made up of only 57 member states, voted to divide the British mandate into 3 states, with 55% of the land allocated to Jews, who only made up a third of the population. The state outline for Jews itself had a big demographic problem. Half of its residents were Palestinian, who rejected the proposal and sought help from another new organization, the Arab League. The British, feeling like the situation was no longer their responsibility, announced they were ending their occupation of Palestine on the 15th of May, 1948.
I have been instructed by His Majesty's government to announce with all solemnity that they have consequently decided that in the absence of a settlement, they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
But this announcement only further escalated the tensions, and almost immediately a civil war broke out between Palestinians. An estimated 1,500 Palestinians and 400 Jews were killed in the fighting. Ben-Gurion, fearing a retaliation from the neighboring Arab states, began to reshape the Haganah from a paramilitary group into the beginnings of a structured army, implementing mandatory conscription for all Jewish men and women aged between 17 and 25. With the clock racing towards the 15th of May, Ben-Gurion and the Zionist leaders saw the war as an opportunity to cleanse the Palestinian population from the areas mapped out by the UN partition plan. On the 10th of March, they met in Tel Aviv and outlined Plan Dalet, a blueprint for targeting Palestinian population centers in the Jewish partition state and enacting a policy of forced depopulation and destruction. That plan was effectively already holding onto the keys of the homes their grandparents had to flee. The testimonies of the Jewish militants who took part in the massacres that unfolded would take decades to come to light, and when they finally did, would be hard for Israeli society to stomach. The 15th of May is what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe. For Israelis, this day is celebrated as their Independence Day. 2 weeks later, David Ben-Gurion, now the first prime minister of the new Jewish state, announced the formation of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, combining the Haganah and the Irgun, with the majority of Lehi members joining its ranks. They immediately turned their attention to fighting off the Arab coalition that had responded to Israel's creation and the displacement of Palestinians. The United Nations appointed Folk Bernadotte as the UN mediator in Palestine in an attempt to reach a diplomatic solution to the unfolding Arab-Israeli war. On the 16th of September, he outlined his proposal, a single union between Palestine and Jordan with 2 sovereign members, one Jewish and one Arab. It would also allow for displaced Palestinians to return to their homes in the now Jewish-controlled cities and villages. In a letter to the UN Secretary General, Bernadette wrote, quote, "It would be an offense against the principles of elemental justice if these innocent victims of the conflict were denied the right to return to their homes, while Jewish immigrants flow into Palestine, and indeed, at least offer the threat of permanent replacement of the Arab refugees who have been rooted in the land for centuries." That letter was published on the 18th of September, 2 days after he had outlined his proposal, but by that time, he was already dead. The day before, while driving through Jerusalem, 4 Lehi operatives ambushed his motorcade and opened fire, killing him and another French military officer. The newly formed Israeli government arrested 200 of Lehi's remaining members and put them on trial for terrorism and disbanding the group. Its leaders, including Yitzhak Shamir, were sentenced to prison, but their sentences would quickly be suspended and they were eventually pardoned. A few years later, Shamir would join a new political party formed by Irgun leader Menachem Begin around the revisionist Zionist ideals of their predecessor, Jabotinsky. It would be called Herut, or freedom. In a letter published in the New York Times in December 1948, some of the world's most prominent Jewish thinkers, including Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt, described Menachem Begin and the Irgun as a terrorist right-wing chauvinist organization, and compared the Harut Party in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. The Israeli Defense Force would become the foundation of the State of Israel, and its history of terror, assassinations, and ethnic cleansing would be wiped clean. The militant leaders who helped shape its bloody origins would go on to shape the country for decades to come. David Ben-Gurion's message of purity and restraint would become the narrative embedded in the army's propaganda, repeated to the world in response to growing criticism of its tactics. The historical voices who challenged this narrative from inside Israel would be outcast and ridiculed into silence. The Harut Party would remain on the fringes of Israel's parliament for the next 2 decades, but its ideas would slowly dominate the mainstream. In 1973, Menachem Begin would join forces with a former Haganah commander, Ariel Sharon, and expand Harut into a wider right-wing coalition called Likud. 4 years later, Begin would be elected Israel's prime minister. He'd be succeeded by former Lehi leader Yitzhak Shamir, who would serve as prime minister from 1983 to 1984 and again from 1986 to 1992. By this time, Likud and its revisionist Zionism roots had become an undeniable wing of Israeli politics, as well as its expansionist ambitions. And just 4 years after the end of Shamir's term, Likud would return to office under the stewardship and vision of a young, highly ambitious, and quietly ruthless prime minister. His name was Benjamin Netanyahu.